Zimbabwe's elections are exactly a week away, and election observers from the SADC Electoral Observation Mission are set to be deployed from this week. The organization will be joining other observers from the African and European unions to ensure free and fair elections in the country. But how much influence and impact do election observers actually have during the polls? Let's unpack this further. We're joined by Professor Kealeboga Maphunye, who is with the Department of Political Sciences at UNISA. Prof, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming in. So this is what the UN says about election observers. They are an essential tool for improving the quality of elections. It builds confidence among the electorate. Is it that simple in a country like Zimbabwe?
In a country like Zimbabwe, Michelle, it's not that simple. Precisely because there are behind-the-scenes issues that happen in the pre-election period, which is where we are. 1 week before those elections, I can tell you that those election observers are dealing with many other things. For instance, access to certain places, which might be a bit difficult because there might be tensions or instability or possible violence. Those are some of the obstacles that election observers face, the security aspect. Let alone also, in some instances, there's also the question of the terrain. Because remember, these are, especially you mentioned the African Union and the European Union. These are people mostly from outside the country. The domestic observers that we sometimes forget, we must not forget them. They are much more important because they know the terrain. But the international ones sometimes struggle with that problem.
So Prof, in a country like Zimbabwe, and you know, a lot of the issues that we unpack as we talk elections are specific to Zimbabwe, right? And to previous elections as well. In a recent sampling of people who will be going to the polls, I believe it was some 2,000 people who were sampled, it did look like Nelson Chamisa's Citizens Coalition for Change would emerge as the victors in next week's polls. Again, not that simple.
Not that simple. I think you are probably referring to one of the surveys by Afrobarometer. Right. You know, there are many of such surveys. Public opinion polls, you know, we always use them, even in South Africa, before in the run-up to elections, as to who is possibly the front runner, the second runner, and so on. But I can tell you that in a country like Zimbabwe, it becomes a bit problematic, because recently the government undertook some kind of legislative reform, which makes it a little bit restrictive, you know, for political political parties to campaign freely.
To campaign freely,
Yes. For example, the CCC of, Chamisa and other opposition parties. Also, some civil society organizations have been complaining that they have not been able to have access to, you know, certain spaces and areas, for instance, in Mashonaland Central, you know, according to the reports that I'm receiving, where they are not able to, you know, conduct free voter education, which is what is expected of civil society organizations. That in itself is one of the hallmarks of determining whether an election is free and fair. You have got to open the spaces. There's got to be transparency by the Electoral Commission. In this case, ZEC. ZEC is the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. We expect it to be more transparent, also to make information easily available to the observers, whether they are domestic, whether they are international. Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about ZEC, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, Prof. What is the track record of the Electoral Commission in Zimbabwe? And, you know, how do we keep that in mind as we build up to next week's election?
We have to keep in mind, Michelle, that Zimbabwe's Electoral Commission is fairly new. It's one of the youngest electoral, management bodies. We call them EMBs, you know, in the region, because it has been undergoing this reform. Remember the disputed 2008 election. This was when many opposition parties, including the observers, complained bitterly about the Zimbabwe Electoral Authority, that they were not impartial. In other words, they were seemingly biased in favor of one of the contenders, namely the ZANU-PF, which is the governing party. And since that disputed election, which many still believe that it actually was lost by Mugabe, the late, and it was won by, Morgan Tsvangirai, who is also late. Unfortunately, he had to withdraw. So therefore, you can't say he actually won the poll because he withdrew. It was violent. So since then, there has been, clouds marring the Zimbabwe Electoral Authority, which is the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, such that many are calling for its reform. Why are they calling for its reform? They say that it must not be seen to be, biased in favor of one or the other of the political contenders. It must be free. It must be impartial. It must be independent.
It must administer.
Absolutely. Like the way we do it internationally when we look, whether it's the UK, whether it is Spain, Greece, whether it is the USA, and we know that, what is happening currently with Donald Trump, who accused that country's, election body that, no, the election was rigged. Now we are seeing that actually it wasn't rigged. So the electoral body must actually not only be fair and impartial, but it must also be seen to be free and impartial.
Yeah. And is that the case? Is there that kind of trust in the Electoral Commission in Zimbabwe?
My view and my hope, Michelle, is that currently the Electoral Commission of Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, has learned a lesson from the 2018 election, because even in the past, the election, it had this cloud hanging. When we look at it from an election management point of view, everything seems to be in order. They are ticking all the boxes. But when you hear the stakeholders in Zimbabwe, civil society organizations, opposition political parties, observers and so on, sometimes they, complain, or they actually mention that they need the commission to do more. Yeah. So that is one of the issues that we are taking into this election. 1 way before the election, we would like to see that to think that it has changed, because recently there were changes, not only to the law, but also to the composition of ZEC. Yeah. It has got new commissioners. It's got a fairly, newly appointed election officials. On the one hand, it's a good thing because you've got the fresh, people who are coming in. But on the other, some of us who know that, it takes much longer, many years to run an election. A fairly immature, election machinery.
Not tried and tested.
Yes, not tried and tested. Especially going to be using, biometric voter methods that they are going to be using, which I'm also told that they are struggling. They were struggling to use them, especially in the run-up when they were doing this election, registration blitz around at the beginning of this year. Yeah. So you would like to make sure that it is doing things the right way. But they are also inexperienced, so therein lies this flip side. On the one hand, fresh legs, yes, we would like them to be fresh and to be able to do their work effectively and efficiently. But on the other hand, I suppose the scarce is that how will they actually pull it out, especially at midnight on, just before the cutoff, when they are now supposed to start counting and so on, and receiving the ballots, the results from the different districts of Zimbabwe.
And as you say, Prof, it's not just about election day.
It's not about election day.
It is about the week, not only this week before election, but the weeks. And it's about previous elections and previous rounds of intimidation, previous people being thrown in jail for one thing or another leading up to election. How are all of these historical issues, insofar as elections and election violence concerned, feeding into what voters will be keeping in mind as they go to the polls even?
They have a serious effect of undermining voter turnout, especially to the voters. Right. Those people who are registered, especially those who are not pro the governing party, could be scared to go to vote. Already, I've received reports of some traditional leaders forcing or at least coercing voters in their own jurisdictions, traditional leaders, chiefs, in other words. Telling them that they must only vote for one party, which is the governing party. That is worrisome. So if you are a voter, the previous, what has happened previously where people are threatened or where people are given, seeds, just on the eve of an election, or some kind of incentive, that has an effect of worrying, the prospective voter, and undermining, an increased voter turnout. Yeah. Already we know that, of course, that's not going to happen in other countries because Zimbabwe doesn't have, diaspora vote. In other words,
right. That is my next question to you. Yeah, if you're not in the country, you can't vote. If you are not
in the country, unless, of course, you are working for a diplomatic, mission, embassy, or working for somehow as an official.
And is it fair to say, Prof, that those are the votes that may well swing an election like this?
Absolutely. In the case of Zimbabwe, I would say that knowing that, pre-COVID, Zimbabwe experienced this, outflow of many citizens, obviously because of the downturn economically of the country.
Yeah.
Many Zimbabweans left, coming to South Africa, going to the UK, going to the USA, and all over the world. So those are the people that actually you would expect to be voting. I suppose the governing party might say that, currently the law says once you're out of the country, you can't vote. But what if those people also were to be voting for the party itself? Yeah. Yeah. So it's a two-way, it's a two-edged sword, so that they are also losing in terms of the votes, because if you are a Zimbabwean sitting here in South Africa and you would like to vote for them, you can't, because clearly the law doesn't make provision for that.
Prof, it's been great talking to you this morning. Thank you so much for your fascinating analysis on the elections in Zimbabwe, which are now exactly 1 week away. Professor Kealeboga Maphunye is with the Department of Political Studies at UNISA. Prof, great to see you. Thanks for coming in.